I want in this video to review questions about the nature of quality in action research. And I'm drawing here on lots of different articles, but mainly the first one we have from John Heron and me on the practice of action research, which has a list of validity procedures. And then there's the article Choice and Quality in Action Research. And finally, the article I wrote with Judy Marshall on action research as taking an attitude of inquiry. And I'm talking generally about action research, but then more specifically about cooperative inquiry. And the first thing I want to say is that there's no way of getting it right. Positivist science views some form of perfect inquiry in, for example, the clinical trial or the controlled experiment. That's not within our grasp and not within our desire, if you like, in action research. Because action research is full of choices about what is important, choices about which way to go. What's important is seeing through, understanding the choices that we've made, the choices that we make collaboratively as an inquiry group, right from the very beginning, and noticing what their consequences would be. Because if we go this way, we haven't gone that way. And there's a question of judgment and politics in that. So we're not trying to work within traditional academic questions here. The purpose of inquiry isn't to describe, excuse me, or interpret our world. It's not to contribute to the fund of knowledge. It's not to deconstruct taken for granted realities. It's not even to develop emancipatory theory. It's to forge a more direct link between intellectual knowledge, propositional knowledge, if you like, and day-to-day practice. And I take that further. It's to create a whole practice of knowing, if you like. It's to create communities of inquiry within communities of practice, as my friend Bill Torbert puts it in a different kind of context. And that would apply in a village in Bangladesh, or within a group of medical practitioners, or in a group of people trying to study panpsychic experience. So if we look more specifically, the first question is, what are we trying to do? What are purposes? What is worthwhile doing here? Action research may primarily be in the service of liberating the oppressed voices of a group of people. So in the early days of the women's movement, for example, the important issue was to articulate, to discover, to rediscover the way patriarchal society impacted on women. When we worked within people in Bangladesh, not my work, but the work of the local people. And I went to hear one of these groups of villagers were sitting on the ground in the middle of this village, and these people described how their inquiry process had led them to realize that actually we're human beings. Actually, we have a right and a capacity to make choices, to understand our world. It was as if a new way of seeing themselves arose from the inquiry process. That might well be the most important thing we can do. Or we might be trying to map a field of human experience, a bit like we're doing in this inquiry. Or we might be making claims for a different form of practice. We might be saying, this is better than that, or this works. And all those different kinds of purposes have different kinds of quality issues. So when my colleague was researching child protection issues following a dreadful case of child abuse and murder in England, the important question was, what has gone wrong in our collaboration between all these different protection agencies, and how can we develop a more effective form of practice that will stop this from happening in the future? So the second point I would make, and that leads on nicely from that point, that last example, is the importance about building democratic dialogue. Because if you think about it, action research is about knowledge, but it's also about power. It says that traditional power is held by the elite, and that's what Salami means when she talks about Europatriarchal knowledge. It's held in the hands of the elite for the purposes of the elite. And if we want to move against that, the first thing we have to do is to build a space where there can be democratic dialogue. And if you're interested in taking that further, there's, I think, a lovely article by Stephen Kemmis in one of the handbooks of action research, the first edition of the Handbook of Action Research, where he talks about that process of building communicative space, drawing on the philosophy of Habermas. Building communicative space in Western societies is also about how do we develop effective group processes. And I put two of my favourite articles about group process onto our reading list. So those first steps of opening communicative space, opening the space for dialogue, how do we invite people to join us? How do we create something which is invitational, that engages people in wanting to come and join us? And there's always an initiative that has to be taken there by one person or by a group of people who may say, well, let's set up a cooperative inquiry to look at this. And then how do we ask other people? So when John Heron and I decided that it would be interesting to set up an inquiry to explore the theory and practice of holistic medicine, the first thing we did was to write out our ideas in a letter of invitation and to send it to a wide number of local practitioners, doctors in general practice. And then we met together, and they had their ideas and we had our ideas, and we pushed and pulled together. We had conflicts until we defined how we were going to undertake that inquiry. It took quite a lot of time. And you'll find in many of the accounts there is a process from that initial meeting. So Kate McCardle sets up a cooperative inquiry with young women in management, and she puts an awful lot of time into doing that, sitting down with people informally, trying to meet them on their young women's grounds, as she can do because she's a young woman herself, doing her best to set up dialogue. But it's not until about halfway through when the young women themselves take charge of the inquiry and take it off in a direction that Kate wasn't particularly pleased about. She didn't want to go that way, but the women did, and so she went with them. And of course, it all worked out nicely in the end. Okay. And then the very idea of many ways of knowing. The many ways of knowing open all sorts of different questions about validity. Is the most important thing we're doing to open new areas of experience, to clarify what our experience is? That may be more important than, for example, how do we develop a different form of practice? How do we do things differently? Or how do we understand things differently? And ideally, all those things come together, but at different points in the inquiry, different things, different ways of knowing will become important. And the third general point I want to make here is about what Judy Marshall and I call developing an attitude of inquiry. And that came from one of our graduate students, Sue Porter, who sadly has died of MS since then. She said at one of our conferences, well, all this stuff, what's really important is we develop an attitude of inquiry in our lives. And we thought it was such a wonderful phrase. We take inquiry into our lives. This is what our lives are about. It's not saying this is the way the world is. It's saying, how is it? What's it like? Being present and open is how John Heron described it. Bracketing preconceptions, all those things I've been banging on about so far this semester, about not bringing your preconceptions to bear on how you see your experience. And these, of course, all these skills are things that develop through the inquiry process. We're not saying at the beginning you've got to have all these things. What we're saying is that through the process of research cycling and collaborative engagement, people develop these kinds of skills. So again, going back to Kate's young women, they were much more capable of inquiring at the end of working together for 6 months than they were at the beginning. They had skills. Well, they had not only individual skills, they had a culture, if you like. So then there are specific quality procedures that we can use. And this in the early days was what we tended to look at. There are specific quality procedures we may choose to employ, which are discussed by us in the Heron and Reason article, the first Heron and Reason article. Research cycling. And this goes with the idea that it's different from orthodox scientific method. It's not a defining how to do it once. It's a continual process of looking and looking again, moving through from experiential to presentational to propositional to practical knowledge. That raises more new, if you like, experiences which we can then represent in different sorts of ways. So research cycling is absolutely fundamental. You don't just do it once, you look again. And I've quoted my student, Angela Brew, if you think you know, then look again. And it's an iterative process that never stops. And within that, there's always the capacity of divergent cycling or convergent cycling. We may want to converge on something and look again very more carefully. We may say, well, that was interesting. Let's go back and have another look at that. Or we may say, well, we've looked at something in quite a lot of detail. Let's see how that fits within a wider field of understanding. So choosing between divergence and convergence is really important. And there's always a balance of action and reflection. It may well be that we have some particular experience that takes us out of our taken for granted things, that takes an awful lot of time to unpick before it transfers back to action. I had a panpsychic experience, the shooting star experience, which I think I put in my group of examples that I put in the files, which happened probably 20 years ago. And I'm still making sense of it. I'm still reflecting on it. But if we reflect all the time without taking that into action, that just becomes an armchair sort of reflective thing, which is not really the point. But on the other hand, if we're acting all the time, if we get into activism without enough reflection, then again, we're not into inquiry. So getting the balance of those. Authentic collaboration, I've mentioned, opening that democratic dialogue. And then scientific method, two other final things. Scientific method is based on skepticism. It distrusts the human capacity for inquiry. It worries about ways that we can fool ourselves. Absolutely right. But what we're doing in action research is restoring faith in the human individual and community capacity for inquiry. We're putting quality back into the individual and the community. So it's not a resort to method. So all these are guidances, not specific methods, but about cultures and practices that challenge our capacity for delusion and consensus collusion. So two of those are challenging consensus collusion, challenging the way we bandy together to see a world in a particular way. And one of the things we chose to do that was the devil's advocate procedure. The idea of the devil's advocate, which we borrow from the Catholic Church process when they are making a saint, or recognizing a saint, maybe I should say. The devil's advocate is the one who collects all the contra-indications to say, actually, this man was just a human being like all the rest of us, a regular human being. And so the devil's advocate procedure is one that confronts rigorously and relentlessly all the ways in which people may be fooling themselves. So when we did the doctor's inquiry, for example, there was one man who was interested in spiritual healing and the laying on of hands as an addition to regular general practice. He was interested in that spiritual side, bringing that spiritual side into medicine. And the challenge was, while you're doing this laying on of hands, how do you know you're not missing the vital signs of meningitis, for example? So the devil's advocate is one who picks up and challenges and says, you think you had the significant dream last night, but maybe it was just indigestion from eating all that cheese before you went to bed. It's a very rigorous and important process, which I'm going to invite you all to engage in. And we can do that individually, or we can do it as a group. So we may appoint, in a collaborative inquiry group, we may appoint someone to play devil's advocate for a session, to challenge all the ways the group is thinking, to really give them permission to go out on a limb. It's really interesting and quite scary sometimes. And the other thing that arises is about this is that we fool ourselves because of the distress that arises from the inquiry process and from what we may discover. Let me tell you a little story about this. When we were working with the doctors on the theory and practice of holistic medicine, and one of our reflective sessions about looking how we were collaborating, it was clear that one of the doctors, was very agitated. And John worked with him. He invited to come and reflect on why he was so upset. And he got more and more irritated and more angry. And he started to shout. We were doing co-counselling kind of practices in those days. Cathartically get into, I hate doctors. I hate doctors. And he was actually physically bashing cushions and getting into this rage. And when he came through that, and he started to tell us the story about how he, as a English northern working class lad, done well at school. Everybody said, you ought to be a doctor. So he'd gone off to medical school in London and found all these upper class southerners who turned up their noses at his northern accent, and how he had colluded with them, and he dropped his northern accent, and he'd worked in middle class medicine, and in doing that he had lost all that he went into medicine to find. And the inquiry process was uncovering for him the pain that came from that. Our contention is that until you uncover that kind of pain, the pain that has repressed your capacity for knowing, you're not really capable of engaging in a creative process. And this happens not just with middle-class doctors or working-class doctors in England, happens throughout the inquiry process. Once you invite people to be inquirers into their own world, it is a distressing process. You have to start uncovering the defences that have stopped you seeing the world in a particular way, or your chosen ways of seeing the world. And that can be upsetting. And you may need co-counselling was what we were using then, but you may need different ways of dealing with that upset. And finally, there's the question of chaos and order. And I think this has run right through this talk. Traditional research is very ordered. Cooperative inquiry is not always ordered. In fact, sometimes it becomes disordered. And we must welcome that when it occurs, because it may help us uncover things that we were not seeing before. And so we borrowed the ideas of Apollonian or Dionysian forms of inquiry, which were originally discussed by Friedrich Nietzsche. The Apollonian is moving through cycles of inquiry, experiential, presentational, propositional, practical knowing, testing it out again, so on and so forth. The Dionysian is when we let go of all that and we simply delve deeper into what it is we don't understand. We delve deeper into what it is that's difficult. It may become, in certain circumstances, chaotic. It may become distressing. And of course, one's always then on the point of moving into a destructive groups process that one can't recover from, which is really why we don't do that very often. But all the really creative inquiry processes have found themselves doing that. Let me give you one example of that. Carlis Douglas, black British woman, inquiring into what is it that sustains, what is it that we black women can do in order to counter the institutional embedded racism in British societies. And she set up a cooperative inquiry to do that. Have I told this story before? I'm not sure. I've told it many times, but I'm not sure if I've told it here. I thought when she said she was going to do that, I thought that what a wonderful thing. These black sisters will be able to get together and really support each other. And Carlos kept coming back and saying how horrid it was and how conflictful it was and how difficult it was. And the reason it was difficult was because of aspects of the black woman's experience, ways they had been taught to behave at their mother's knee, so to speak, about what black women were like, which were not helpful for them in their processes of growing up. You can look at so it was a very distressing process rather than a creative process. Well, it turned out to be creative because they were willing to go through that distress. So there's a lot there. There's a lot of choices, is the point I'm making. There's a lot of choices about what we're doing and how we're doing it. And we asked our students doing PhDs with us to always include a chapter on what are the choices I think we've made in this inquiry process and what are the consequences of those choices, to really reflect and to claim the ground of quality on which their work rested, and to look very rigorously at where quality might be lacking. And I think that's a really important and interesting discipline to do. Thank you very much.